seen it with the thuzz. You've seen it without the thuzz, with just the fast, and with tunes where the thuzz should be. Now, prepare for the latest mix of F words and numbers in Furious 7. That's so boring. Can we use the Japanese title? Wild Speed, Sky Mission. Way better. After 6 Fast and Furiouses, you thought they were done, because they more or less kept saying they were done.
End of the road. One last job. I thought that was our last job. Our old life is gone.
How long have we been doing this?
We're getting paid, right?
But now they're back for one last ride. Again.
After this, we're done.
One last ride.
Which is, at the bare minimum, their next to last ride. But after that ride, they've got to be done riding, right? I mean, where are they going to go next? Space?
First a tank, then the plane, now we got a spaceship?
I would totally watch that. What began as Point Break with cars has been spun off, rebooted, turned into a heist film, and jacked up on steroids. Now, they're really stretching to find new things to jump a car out of. Experience some of the most over-the-top set pieces of the year, like this awesome car skydiving sequence. Then it raises the bar with this incredible skyscraper jump scene. Then watch their budget run out before the finale, which is basically a generic car chase, while 2 gorillas hit each other with sticks in a parking lot. So hit the streets once again with Dominic Toretto, master of the dramatic over-the-shoulder turnaround. He's the man with the plan, even if the plan is incredibly stupid, like driving headfirst into a car, driving headfirst off a cliff, driving headfirst into a car again, or driving headfirst off a parking garage. Car Wars, Episode 7.
See, you and me, we're from different worlds.
Hey, you stole that from Hootie and the Blowfish.
Movies are Fast and Furious, and they just keep coming. Why? Because you keep watching them. You keep buying the movie ticket, and you keep giving them $1 billion every time, so they keep making them. But we are not talking about the movie franchise. We are talking about what does God's words tell us about anger and impatience and moving at a pace that's fast and furious. My name is Carlos. I'm one of the pastors here. I'm an executive team member, and I also get to serve as our North Campus pastor, and we're so glad that you're watching. You may notice it's a little bit different this week if you've been watching the last few weeks, because we did have live worship. There are a few people in the auditorium. They are leaders who've been trained, and they're here this week. And if you're one of those people who gets a little bit antsy, even though we're going to focus online for the weeks to come, but you're getting a little antsy and you'd like to go to a live recording starting tomorrow on our website, gatewaychurch.com, you can sign up to attend a live recording. Seating is limited. You do have to wear a mask, but it will be worth it for you if you want to get out of your house and worship together. Now, we're going to jump into this series, because I want you to know that we knew this was coming. We knew this time would come. We knew that in our culture and everything that's taking place, that this was a time to talk about anger and impatience. What you don't know, that I'm going to give you insight to, is that we have been talking about this series for months now. We talked about this before the unrest. We talked about this before everything began to change. We talked about this before COVID-19, before civil unrest, before some of the things happening in racial justice in our country, and we just knew that we had to continue with the series. I mean, the truth is that more people are dealing with life issues than ever before, between depression, anxiety, loneliness, economic stress. Our nation is suffering from a lack of peace. I mean, people have had loved ones die, and they can't even bury them in peace. So we're doing a memorial here at Gateway this next week, and we had to limit the amount of people who could come to the memorial. And so we're dealing with all sorts of emotions, all sorts of things happening. And the truth is that right now, not last week, a year ago, right now, our nation is stirred. And right now, the workplace can be tense, and a lot of people, a lot of homes are on edge. And right now, churches, a lot of people who attend church, who call themselves Christians, they want to do something. They want to make a difference, whether it's COVID-19 or things happening in our Black community. People want to do something. They want to take a next step, and what do I do? And if we're not careful, frustration can really set in, and it can grow to anger. And here's the crazy thing about anger. Anger is a feeling, and anger is also an action. It is both a noun and a verb. But something that anger is not is that anger is never the root issue of what we're feeling or what we're doing. And impatience and anger, if we're not careful, it works its way, and it eventually has to come out. And if we're not careful to be mindful of the way we think and mindful of the way that we act, eventually it bubbles up to the surface and explodes out in all sorts of ways. Let me tell you a quick story about where my anger issues came from. Now, sometimes when I'm speaking, people will say, Carlos, you're really intense, you're really passionate, and you're kind of funny, but man, sometimes I don't know how to take you because you just seem so passionate. Some people would say angry, and my kids will say, Dad, you're so mean. I'm not mean. It's an optical illusion, let's call it that, right? Because this little line in my forehead right here, this little butt crack, I was born with it, okay? I can't help it. I don't look angry all the time. My mom said I was born with this little line, and Botox will not take it away. Not that I've tried or anything, but this intensity on my face is because I'm a passionate person. Where did that stem from? And I was thinking this week about where did my parents model for that intensity for me? I'm going to tell a story of each of my parents. The first one's going to be about my mom. I was 12 years old, and we were leaving South Texas. I grew up in a small town called Uvalde, Texas, west of San Antonio. And we were moving to Michigan, and our move there, I love school, and I love learning. And so my mom and I go to the school to register for classes, and I was very disappointed when I was told that I was not allowed to sign up for honors courses at the new school. We had met with the counselor, and we'd met with the teacher who represented the honors program, and they said, no, you can't sign up for the honors courses. And the way they did it, they said, you guys down in Texas have a different education system. It's not the same as here in Michigan. And they're like, we have a higher standard than you Texas folks. And I was like, well, I'll show you a higher standard. I'm proud to be from Texas. I'm proud of my education. I'm proud of my roots. And my mom, she knew something was happening, and she said, hold on a minute. Why don't you just test my son? Why don't you just test him? And if we're wrong, he's not ready. And the lady said, no, the test is not available. We don't think your kind would do well in the honors program. I'm 12 years old. I don't really know what your kind means, but my mom grew up as a migrant worker, and she knew exactly what it meant. It had nothing to do with Texas. My mom talked with a very heavy Spanish accent, and she turned into another woman because my mom loves Jesus, and she's so sweet, and she's so kind. She has this great disposition, but she was getting angry. And I was like, ooh, Incredible Hulk is coming out. Oh, what's going to happen? And my mom said, mijo, prepárate, get ready. You're going to take the test. And I'm like, well, the lady just told me, you're going to take the test. And she stood up for me that day. She goes, you're going to give my son the test. And the lady didn't know what to do, so she got a little frustrated, and she gave me the test. I took the test. An hour later, I'm in the honors program. And I was like, yeah, I'll show you I can do it, right? I'll show you I can do it. I get into the class with the same teacher who was with the classroom. And I was taught in my education, it's okay to have to think outside the box. It's okay to question things, especially when it came to education. So I'm 12 years old. I'm questioning the teacher and what she's teaching, and she kicks me out of the classroom because I'm being disruptive. So I have to take my desk in front of my entire classroom and go out to the hallway for the rest of the semester. And back in the day, students, if you're watching, what we used to do when I was growing up, all the grades were posted on the wall, and you knew who got what grades. And we had a ranking system. And I had told myself that day, I am going to be first in this class. I'm going to show this teacher that I can get an A, top of the class, even without seeing her face. And that's what I did. And I remember thinking, for the rest of my life, I always want to be top of my class. For the rest of my life, I never want to be second class. For the rest of my life, because my mom showed me, you don't have to be second class. But it was this righteousness. There was something right about it. And I remember thinking, they had my transcripts. They interviewed me. They knew I could speak English. They just didn't want me. And my mom said, you may not want him, but we're going to fight for him to have his place. Fast forward 10 years and I'm in college. And this professor, 72-year-old Dr. Moon, he made everybody stand up. There were 30 people in the class in a 60-seat classroom. He told us to go to the back of the classroom. He said, whoever wants to get an A needs to sit in the front row, because front row people get A's. Well, all of the A students ran up to the front to get the front rows. Whoever wants a B, go behind them. Everybody went, and I was the last one in the back of the room. You can tell I like a good fight. And I stood in the back of the room. He said, looked at his paper, Mr. Ortiz. You know how you knew I was Mr. Ortiz? I was the only person of color in the room. So he was like, Mr. Ortiz, where would you like to sit? And this was not righteous. This was unrighteous. I said, Dr. Moon, you pick a chair and I'll get an A from there. He picked a chair in the very back in the corner, and I sat there all semester long. And I was mean to him. And I questioned everything he said, even if I agreed with it. You know what happened in the last end of the semester? He made me give the very last speech of the class. And he said, Mr. Ortiz, top of the class. Dr. Moon was 72. We ranked class. I was top of the class. And he's like, good job. And I go to sit down. And Dr. Moon, after 3 months of arguing with this kid, who wasn't angry out of righteousness, I was just angry. He looked at me, the 72-year-old white man. He said, I want you to stay up here in front of the class. He took off his glasses, and he began to cry. And he said, I'm sorry for the way I treated you this whole semester. And nobody had ever done that to me. He didn't have to do that. He was the professor. He was in charge. He could do whatever he wants, and yet he apologized to me. And I go to sit down, and my friend says, you jerk, turn around and apologize to him. I was like, for what? You disrupted the class half the time. You caused problems. And I was like, I'm not doing that. Everybody walks out. Dr. Moon stops me and says, I really meant it, Mr. Ortiz. You're going to be a good pastor one day. I didn't even want to be a pastor. I wanted to be a businessman, so I ignored him. and then I walk out the door, and I turn around, and I looked at him, and I said, Dr. Moon, I am so sorry for the way I disrespected you. I had never done that to anybody. And yet we had this moment because it's okay to want to do something and make change out of righteousness, something that is rooted in who God is and in justice. But it's not okay to let those things that are unrighteous, those things that are apart from God, those things that separate us from God, to allow us to be angry in a way that is not connected to anything that has to do with what is right. And my mom showed me the way. She showed me that I don't have to fall into my worst impulses. I don't have to give in to peer pressure. That I could turn the tables in my own way and make a difference. But I had to be focused on the change I wanted to make. And if we're not careful, we can paint brushstrokes in this country of this person's this and that person's that because of the way they display their frustration. But I would tell you what would happen if a camera were on you all the time. Not any one of us can control our emotions every single time. At some point, what we think and we feel come out. So as we walk through Fast and Furious, I want us to understand that we have access to the power of who God is. We have access to be reliant on God in this journey of life and our emotions and everything that we are. And in that, God sets us up to succeed through his Son, Jesus. And that is what we're going to talk about. As we go into God's word over these next few weeks, we're going to really be walking through 1 and 2 Samuel. So take a few minutes, not if you have time, take some time. Read through 1st and 2nd Samuel. I don't even know if you know this, but it's like a movie, which is why we picked a movie theme. It has all sorts of things in there. It has people from the lowest class. It has things that has to do with murder, has to do with sex, has to do with all sorts of things in those chapters. And as you read it, you really get to understand the heart of God, because the main character in this is David, a man after God's own heart. And we get to see the journey before him, the journey he walks through, the journey after him, and what it means and how do we interact with anger and impatience. What does it cost us? So we're going to jump right in. We're going to give some context to what's happening. The people of Israel, they are wanderers. We've talked about this a few times this year. They're wanderers, and they're looking for their home. They're really wanting what's called the promised land. And they can't ever get to the promised land. So there's stories of them being slaves in Egypt, and they're led out of that by Moses. And then Joshua leads them into the promised land, and they have this relationship with God. They have this direct access to who God is, and yet God provides spiritual leaders to guide them in those journeys. But it comes to a point where they see all these other countries, they see all these other nations, they see all these other people groups who have kings and queens and royalty, and they want to have royalty. They want to be represented by a person. They want to be represented by somebody they can feel, somebody they can touch, and they plead out for a king. And at that time, Samuel, who's the spiritual leader, he becomes the messenger on behalf of God. And he begins to let them know, you don't want to do this. You don't want to go down this road because you have this beautiful relationship with God that nobody else has. There is no in-between, and you're choosing to give that up so somebody can represent you. So somebody can go before God for you. But are you sure you want to do that? And we've got to be careful, because in our human nature, oftentimes we want to shift responsibilities to others rather than live a life that's accountable or live an accountable life. I mean, how many times do we get tired of life? How many times is it just easier to say, you know what, I really don't want to serve the poor. I want to make a difference, but I don't have the time to, so I'm just going to write the check. And that's great. We're grateful for the generosity, and we can put that in the hands of incredible volunteers who want to make a difference. But how many times has God asked us to be hands and feet? If we're not careful, we can push off that responsibility to others. And that's what's happening right now. Israel is passing off the responsibility of tending to their relationship with God, and they want a king. So here's a few things we're going to learn about the people of Israel and this first character, Saul, who is the first king of Israel. The first one is this: we have to take personal responsibility. When it comes to anger and frustration, we have to take personal responsibility. Hal Elrod, who lives in Austin, says this: the moment you take responsibility for everything in your life is the moment you can change anything about your life. The moment you take responsibility for everything in your life is the moment you can change anything in your life. I've shared about my background quite a bit in these first few months, and I remember my dad, again, grew up with 3 stepfathers. We'll tell his story some other day, but my dad had 42 brothers and sisters. That is not a mishap. 42. 4-2. My grandfather was an awesome man towards the end of his life, but he wasn't so awesome towards the beginning of his life, right? He was a short little white Irish guy, blonde hair, blue eyes, spoke Spanish, he had incredible business, and my grandfather loved black women. And when I mean women, I mean women with an E, not an A. My grandfather, short little white guy, had children with 19 black women, 36 children. And out of 36, he had 32 boys. He was a baby factory, baby boy factory. And my dad, I think it was number 16 or 17, I forget, right? And when he was being born, he was one of 5 kids being born in the hospital at the same time from the same dad. And My dad wasn't raised by his father, and he was raised by a single mom, and he was raised in a really rough neighborhood. My grandmother she's beautiful, she's awesome, she's this tall black woman, and she's really slender. She's got beautiful legs because she still walks everywhere, but she grew up sleeping with a machete in her bed. That's how rough her neighborhood was. And that's how she defended my dad, her firstborn, her oldest. And my dad had 2 stepfathers, and all sorts of crazy things happened with abuse. We have all kinds of stories. He still has scars on his body from what some of his stepfathers did to him. And then he's born with 3 boys. You know how many times when I was a teenager, especially 11 and 12, if you've ever had an 11 or 12-year-old, you need Jesus. Because it's tough. You know how many times my dad would walk into my room and I can see his shadow, and he turns the corner and he looks at me and I'm like, he is going to give me the beating of my life. And he would slam the door and go for a walk. And I go to my mom and say, well, where's Dad? He went for one of his famous walks. Why does he go for a walk? Because if he doesn't go for a walk, he's going to walk all over you. Because that's the way he was brought up. And my dad, as a Christ follower, as a growing Christian, said, I have to begin to take responsibility for my life. I cannot pass on a history of violence to my children, even though it's all I know. We have to take responsibility. And John 4 challenges, it says, we are called to be slow to anger and rich, abounding in love. Slow to anger means sometimes you're going to be angry, but how fast do you get there? That's the reflection of your character. It's how slow can we get there. Because the slower we go, the more chance we have to not grow into anger, but to walk in patience. And they were called to be abounding in love. You know what abounding means? It means not just enough love to get through. It means having love for everybody who comes in contact with you. How do we do that? It's through the access that we have to God's power in our life for change. This is quite similar. Luke 12:48. To whom much is given, much is expected. To whom much is given, much is expected. How much grace was given to us? How much was given to us through when Jesus died on the cross for our sins, and we are called to give that same grace and love to other people. And here we have the people of Israel had decided that they're tired of this access to God. They want a leader. And notice what happens here in 1 Samuel chapter 8, verse 20 and 22. When Samuel heard all the people, he repeated it before the Lord. And the Lord answered, listen to them, listen to the people of Israel, and give them a king. God gave them the desire of their heart, even though it didn't line up with God's heart. And sometimes I don't understand that. You see, God had made covenant with Israel. He'd given them special access, and they chose to give that up to have a king. And God's like, okay, this is what you want. I'm going to give you that. Even though it didn't line up with his heart. See, God gives them what they want, but how many of us are glad we didn't get everything we wanted? You know how many times when I was 16 years old, if you're a teenager, I was 16 years old, and I really wanted to date, I won't say her name, really wanted to date this one girl, and she was beautiful, and she was awesome, and now, a few years later, I'm like, oh, thank you, Jesus. And I never thought I would do this, but I'm going to quote Garth Brooks. When he says, sometimes I thank God for unanswered prayers. What were some of the dumb things we prayed for? God's like, no, I'm not going to do that. But in this case, he answered their prayer, even though it didn't line up with his heart. And that's really difficult for me to understand. But the second thing we learn is this. We begin to learn from the struggles we have with anger and impatience. The people ended up with a series of really good and really bad kings that we're going to cover over the next few weeks. But that first king, the first king was Saul. And what could the people learn? What did they learn through all those years of wandering and roaming, trying to find the promised land, trying to find a king? What could they learn as they dive into this relationship with King Saul? Because I wonder, how many times do we learn? Talking to some older people in our church who said, man, I remember the riots of the 1960s, and I remember early 90s as a teenager watching Rodney King get beat in LA, and I'm wondering, what can we learn? Do we have to repeat the same patterns? Can we learn? Can we grow? And I think we are in some capacities. But I wonder, can we truly understand that we can make a difference? Do we understand that we can grow from these and make a difference for the next generation? Do we understand that there is a difference between people who are peacefully protesting for justice and change and those who are out there maybe causing some damage? But that doesn't mean we dismiss the message of growing and understanding and learning from our struggles. There is a difference between police officers who are protecting those who need protecting and those who are using their power towards abuse. There is a difference, and I want to make sure we understand that. We have multiple police officers in our church who are working through what that means as they give their lives to protect people, at the same time understanding that they may not be like everybody else, that there is a segment of the population who isn't doing what's right, and yet if we're not careful, we will say everybody and everyone who believes this way and everyone who believes that way. And I wonder, what happened to all of us using our brain and thinking and dialoguing and having conversations with people? That's the beauty of it. That's the beauty of relationship. That's the beauty of Gateway. That's the beauty of who God is in the body of Christ, that we can have conversations and begin to understand and learn from one another, because we have to learn. Because we can be the generation that actually insists for change, good change. So Saul's the first king, and now he is coming into a country that really has lost its way, because they're trying to remove themselves from a relationship with God, and they want the king to stand in his place. But things aren't all that bad with Saul. I mean, we're going to talk about him as a bad example, but God did choose him as king, and he did choose him from the least tribe, and he did raise him up. And there were a lot of good qualities about Saul, and yet in his character, there were cracks early on. In his character, we would see he would be exposed because he never worked on those character traits. But we know God was with him, because in 1 Samuel chapter 10, verse 9 through 10, it says this: as Saul turned to leave Samuel the prophet, God changed Saul's heart. And all these signs were fulfilled that day. When he and his servant arrived at Gibeah, a procession of prophets met him, and the Spirit of God came powerfully upon him, and he joined in their prophesying. God was with Saul. Yes, he had character flaws, and yes, he made some mistakes that we'll talk about, but God was still with him. Helen Keller says this: the struggle of life is one of our greatest blessings. It makes us patient, sensitive, and godlike. It teaches us that although the world is full of suffering, it is also full of the overcoming of it. And even though Saul had so much in his life he had to overcome, that God was with him, and that God wanted him to learn from the struggles. And each of us have access to God the way Saul had access to God, to learn from those struggles. But the third thing is really important. It's something that Saul didn't do. We have to ask for wisdom and guidance. At one point in his journey, Saul faced off with the Philistines, and he was going off to battle, and he needed God to be with him. So he was going to make a sacrifice, and he invited again Samuel, the prophet, and he was supposed to be there after 7 days, and Samuel didn't show up. Don't you hate that? When you're on time for something, and the other person doesn't show up? When you've ordered something, and they send you the email and the text saying it's going to be here between this hour and this hour, and it doesn't happen? Or they send you that email that says between 9 a.m. and 4 p.m. we'll make the delivery. What are you talking about? You need a 7-hour window? And Saul had this window, and the window closed. So he took it upon himself. We're going to read a few verses. 1 Samuel 13, starting with verse 8. Saul waited 7 days and the time set by Samuel. But Samuel did not come to Gilgal. And Saul's men began to scatter. So he said, bring me the burnt offering and the fellowship offerings. And Saul offered up the burnt offering. Just as he finished making the offering, Samuel arrived, of course, just a tad late. And Saul went out to greet him. And Samuel says, you have done a foolish thing. You have not kept the command the Lord your God has given you. If you had, he would have established your kingdom over Israel for all time. How hard is it that you wait and you wait and you wait and you think you're doing the right thing, but you take everything in your own hands, and what happens is you ruin everything. James 1 verse 5 says this, if any of you lack wisdom, you should ask God, who gives generously to all without fault, and it will be given to you. Every person who's listening to me right now, no matter where you are in the spectrum of faith, no matter what you've done, no matter who you are, we have the wisdom of God at our disposal. The question is, do we ask for wisdom? Because when we finally get wisdom, we're able to choose the right way. We get to choose. And Saul's character had a lot of cracks and made a lot of mistakes. But we need to shore up the foundation of our heart. And for Saul, he was so insecure that he desperately needed affirmation. He wanted other people to see him as a king. He wanted other people to see him as the rightful owner of a kingdom. And he cared more about the perception. He cared more about the optics. He cared more about, he didn't have these, but he cared more about the press conference. He cared more about what people wrote about him than it was the character and the content of his heart. And I know we make mistakes. If you've ever done recovery or 12 steps, you know there's times where you relapse, where you make a mistake. But do we grow from that mistake? Do we seek out wisdom to find steps back to the right path? When you and I fail, we need to start again, and it's okay to start again. When I first came to Christ, I stopped everything cold turkey. I stopped drinking, I stopped going to clubs, I stopped sleeping around, and I remember 2 days in, I was sitting in my room by myself, and I thought, I can't do this. How am I going to do this? How am I not going to drink anymore and party? How am I not going to get into a drunken stupor? How am I not going to sleep around anymore? I didn't know how I would do it, but I took it one day at a time, and when I did mess up, my goal was to have more time in between every time I messed up and turn my heart to God. There's going to be relapses, and I have to be patient in the process. We all have to be patient in the process, because if not, we will make mistakes that will truly scar us. And the truth is that Saul wanted this relationship with God that Samuel had, but he wasn't patient enough to develop it. He took things into his own hands. And you got to remember this. It is not a sin to be tempted. With impatience, with anger, it is not a sin to be tempted. It is how we respond when we are tempted that determines the kind of person we will be. Saul grew into a person who lacked character. He grew into his flaws. He grew into more outbursts. He grew into the person he grew into be. You got to understand, people lacking character don't do the things we just talked about. They don't take personal responsibility. They don't learn from their mistakes. They don't ask others for help when they need help. And they believe they will never change. And if we're not careful, we will self-sabotage our own lives because we'll believe a narrative that is false. And Saul believed a narrative that was false. He believed he wasn't good enough. He believed he had to take it upon himself. And when he did, he ruined things. I'm going to read a few verses and we're going to close. 1 Samuel 15, 17 through 19. And Samuel says this, although you were once small in your own eyes, did you not become the head of the tribes of Israel? The Lord anointed you king over Israel, and he sent you on a mission saying, go and completely destroy the wicked people. He was on assignment. Even though he was out of sorts with God, God still was with him, and God wanted to use him. And God said, go do this, and he gave very specific instructions. Go destroy those wicked people, the Amalekites. Wage war against them until you have wiped them out. Why did you not obey? Why did you pounce on the plunder and do evil in the eyes of the Lord? And here's Saul's moment. Here's Saul's moment when he's caught. You ever been caught cheating or lying or caught just not doing the right thing? This is Saul's moment. You know, when your heart is beating out of your chest and you're like, I should say the right thing. I should do the right thing. I should not lie anymore. Saul had the moment where he's being called out, and instead of repenting, instead of taking personal responsibility, instead of learning from his mistakes, instead of asking for wisdom, instead of bowing on his knees and saying, God, I'm sorry, guess what he does? He tries to explain it all away. Verse 20 and 21. But I did obey the Lord. I went on the mission the Lord assigned me. I completely destroyed the Amalekites and brought back Agag, their king. And the soldiers took sheep and cattle from the plunder and the best of what was devoted to God in order to sacrifice them to the Lord, your God, at Gilgal. You see, I know I was supposed to not bring anything back, but this was the best of the best. I know I shouldn't have done that deal at work. I knew we took more money from those people than we should have. I know we did this, and we know we did that, but I tithed off of it, and I gave it to the church, or I did good with it, but it came from a source of impatience. It came from a source that was not in line with God's heart. Have you ever done that? Have you ever tried to explain away your decisions and your mistakes instead of just owning them? When we do that, it eats at our soul. Eats at who we are. And Samuel replied, verse 22 and 23, does the Lord delight in burnt offerings and sacrifices as much as in obeying the Lord? To obey is better than sacrifice, and to heed is better than the fat of rams. For rebellion is like the sin of divination, and arrogance like the evil of idolatry, because you have rejected the word of the Lord. He has rejected you as king. When we try to explain our lives instead of humbly coming before the Lord, we get what we deserve. Saul's greatest fear of being rejected was the self-fulfilling prophecy. Sir, I don't know who you are. This isn't even in my notes. I don't know who you are. I don't know what you're going through. And you're afraid that woman's going to leave you, your wife or your girlfriend. You're afraid your kids are going to hate you, but you don't mean to hit them. You don't mean to berate them, but you do. And your greatest fear of somebody leaving you, your greatest fear of somebody hurting you is going to be a self-fulfilling prophecy because of your anger and because of your impatience. If you're a boss, if you have your own company, you're afraid your employees are going to leave you, but your impatience and your anger is going to be a self-fulfilling prophecy. Can we take the time to have access to God and humble ourselves and say, God, help me. Help me not to be impatient. Help me not to be angry so that my greatest fears don't come to pass. We have to own our own mess. We have to learn from them. Humbly ask for guidance beyond our own natural wisdom. And then we step out and we do what's right. And I don't know where you are in your relationship with God, or maybe this is the first time you're ever engaging who God is. But I will tell you this, we believe at Gateway, it's always the right next step in every situation to go before God and humbly offer ourselves, saying, God, break us, remake us. I'm yours. We ask for wisdom. God, as we get ready to close out this service, I ask that you be with us. We're one church in thousands of locations right now. We're in homes all over the place. And as we sing this song, God, we don't sing it to close out the message and turn off the screens. We sing it as a song of faith from our heart to you, that you are above us and your ways are above us and your knowledge is above us. So we humbly come before you when we ask you to be with us. In Jesus' name, amen.